Welcome, everybody. This is Frederick Meyer with Writers.com. Thank you so much for joining us for this workshop on writing devotional poetry with Shankar Narayan. Shankar Narayan explores identity, power, mythology, and technology in a world where the body is flung across borders, yet possesses unrivaled power to transcend them. Shankar is a 5-time Pushcart Prize nominee and the winner of prizes and fellowships from Kundiman, Hugo House, Jack Straw, Flyway, and River Heron. He is a 4Culture Grant recipient for Claiming Space, a project to lift the voices of writers of color, and his chapbook Postcards from the New World won the Paper Nautilus debut series chapbook prize. Shankar draws strength from his global upbringing and from his work at the intersection of civil rights and technology. In Seattle, he awakens to the wonders of Cascadia every day, but his heart yearns east to his other hometown, Delhi. Shankar, thank you so much for being with us, and please take us away.
All right. Thank you, Fred. Thanks to Writers.com for hosting this seminar. Hi, everyone. I'm Shankar Narayan. I use he, they pronouns, and welcome to this very brief seminar on devotional poetry, particularly as it's practiced in the South Asian Sufi tradition. So in this short hour that we'll be sharing together, I'm excited to basically give you all a little bit of a taste of what Sufism itself is, the space of Sufi poetry in South Asia, how that sort of evolved, including its broader context in the evolution of devotional poetry. Some of you may be familiar with the Bhakti poetry movements in South Asia, which are a parallel movement in Hinduism. So we'll talk a little bit about what all of that means in the context of the religions of Hinduism and Islam, and also how we can access the space in our writing, right? As writers, how we can take inspiration from it and let it kind of transport us, right, into alternative frames of mind that help us take the brakes off of our own writing, right, and make it more electric and dynamic. So before we dive in, as usual, for every space that I'm in, let's start with some community agreements to sort of set an intentional space. So this is an inclusive, respectful, and courageous space. If you tend to be quiet, step up into participation. If you tend to be verbose and take up a lot of airtime, step back. Be aware of your privilege in the space. Listen to one another and help create the kind of supportive space where everyone's thoughts and reactions can truly be seen and heard. Aim to bring your best self to the short time we'll share together. And finally, nobody knows everything, but together we know a lot. And usually on Zoom, I ask people if you're comfortable, keep your camera on. It's weird to talk to a bunch of black boxes, and it's helpful to actually be able to see you. And because my spaces are also about building community, right? It helps us to be able to see one another. Not a diktat, but a suggestion. And thank you for doing that if you're comfortable. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in and make the best use of our 1 hour. So I'm going to be interspersing videos and poetry with talking, because Sufi poetry is really best not only spoken about and read, right, but actually experienced. So that direct experience is really an integral part of this tradition, which is really about, at its heart, seeking union with the divine, right? Not through some sort of book knowledge, but really through a visceral experience. And of course, I'm well aware, right, that those who have been immersed in the Sufi space for many decades can also often express some of these concepts with a really elegant simplicity. So we'll listen to some of those Sufi masters, right, Qawwali musicians in particular, in South Asia, who just live this tradition every day of their lives. It's also worth noting that this is not a theological space, right? I'm not actually a Sufi myself. I don't pretend to be one. But rather the idea is to try to understand enough about this tradition, right, to be able to incorporate some of this divine ecstasy into our own writing practices. So with that, we are going to start with a short video, about 7-8 minutes. And this is featuring a person named Mukhtiar Ali and his father, who's a charming gentleman. They're both charming gentlemen. These people are Sufi Qawwali singers in the village of Pugal in Rajasthan state in India. And in this video, they explain a little bit about the essence, right? I mean, it's just chit chat, really, right? They're sitting around shooting the breeze, but it turns out, right, that even in this casual conversation, you get to understand a little bit about the essence of Sufism. And they also sing some verses from important Sufi poets, including Baba Bulle Shah, who we'll talk about a little bit, who wrote in Punjabi. So as you're watching this video, pay attention to how the narrative and the singing and the lyrics themselves make you feel, right? So try to keep a mirror inward on what's happening, right? Do you notice any response in yourself? And we'll chat a little bit about, you know, how you react to what's in the video once the video's done. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, except that host has disabled participant screen sharing. So Fred.
Of course. All right, try it again.
Share screen, there we go. Okay, and Fred, can you tell me, I'm trying to optimize for video clip, but it doesn't necessarily want to let me do that. Not sure why. Okay, let's try it. Can you see my screen, Fred?
Yes.
Very good. All right, here we go.
अरे बोलो भाई साधु अरे जय जयकार बरसे कमलियो विजय आसमान बरसे कमलियो विजय आसमान बोलो भाई साधु जय जयकार
बहुत खूब।
खूब है
तो ये उल्टी बानी का क्या मायना?
माना ये होता है कि बरस से कमलियो भीज आसमान। जो इंसान का जो अंदर भीजता ना, जब शरीर को पानी मिलता है, आसमान इसको बना दिया। बरस से कमलिया, कमलिया, कमल क्या होता है? फूल होता है इंसान के अंदर में,
इंसान के दिल में।
दिल में वो सब शरीर को पानी देता है, रोटी देता है।
तो ये सब दादा आपने कहाँ सीखा?
मैंने कहा कोई कि इंग्लैंड से थोड़ी सीखे, हम तो यहीं सीखे हैं। इंग्लैंड तो हम गए भी नहीं।
हमारे यहाँ क्या है कि जागरण और सत्संग दो चीज़ें होती है, और दोनों में क्या है कि हिंदू और मुसलमान दोनों शामिल होते हैं उनमें। जैसे गांव में तो पूरा एकदम है, अगर 15-20 मुसलमान हर जागरण में आपको मिल जाएंगे।
अच्छा,
उससे ज़्यादा। और वहाँ क्या है कि हमारे क्या है कि 12 बजे तक तो भजन चलेंगे देवी देवताओं के। जैसे मान लो हनुमान जी के चल रहे हैं, या किसी रामचंद्र जी भगवान के चल रहे हैं, या कोई उस 12 बजे के बाद में क्या है फिर संतों की बात चलेगी वहाँ। और इन पे फिर क्या है कि बहस होती है लोगों की। भजन तो एक ही गाया जाएगा, लेकिन चर्चा कम से कम 2 घंटे चलेगी। 2 घंटे चलेगी। वो संतों की बात है सिर्फ उसमें, चाहे कबीर ले लो, चाहे बुल्ले शाह ले लो, चाहे शाह हुसैन ले लो, चाहे शाह बाऊ ले लो। उन लोगों ने उन धर्म को अलग रख के जो उन्होंने खुद ने महसूस किया है वो बातें होंगी। सूफिया में यही है मकसद के, उसमें ना तो कृष्ण जी का नाम है कहीं, ना ही कहीं अल्लाह का नाम है, ना ही कहीं राम का नाम है। वो एक प्यार का रिश्ता है, उसमें प्रेम का रिश्ता है। मालिक को वो एक अपने मासूक के रूप में उन्होंने माना, वो है सूफिया
की मंगना और की मंगना मैं रब को लूं, और की मंगना मैं रब को लूं, नित खैर मंगा तेरे दम भी। नित नित खैर मंगा सोनिया नित खैर मंगा नित खैर मंगा सोनिया वे तेरी दुआ ना कोई और मंगदी मैं नित नित खैर।
और सूफियाना वो है जिसने हदीस को तोड़ दिया। हदीस माने वो धर्म की किताब है, कुरान धर्म की किताब है, कलाम धर्मों की किताब के हिसाब से कव्वाली चलेगी। और सूफियाना है वो उससे बंधा हुआ, वो अलग है। बात होगी सिर्फ मालिक की कि सबका मालिक है।
सारे सपोर्ट हटा दिए, सारे सपोर्ट जितने होते हैं ना, जैसे जब धर्मों के सपोर्ट सब हटा देते हैं, वो डायरेक्टली बात करें,
डायरेक्ट हॉटलाइन
तेरे प्यार दिता जदों दा सहारा वे तेरे प्यार दिता जदों दा सहारा वे सहारा तेरे प्यार दिता जदों दा सहारा वे माया भुल गया मैनू जग सारा वे माया भुल गया मैनू जग सारा वे खुशी ए हो मैनू सजना बतेरी दुआ ना कोई और मंगदी खुशी ए हो मैनू सजना बतेरी दुआ ना कोई और मंगदी मैं नित खैर मंगा सोनिया वे तेरी दुआ ना कोई और मंगदी। मिल की खुदाई वे तू मिलिया तू मिलिया तू मिलिया तू मिलिया तू मिलिया तू मिलिया 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 तू मिलिया मिल की खुदाई वे तू मिलिया ते मिल की खुदाई वे हथ जोड़ आखा पाई ना जुदाई वे हथ जोड़ आखा पाई ना जुदाई वे मर जावांगी जे अख में थी तेरी दुआ ना कोई और मंग।
देखिए, जब मैं मोमडन हूँ तो लोग तो ये चाहते हैं ना कि ये गाना बजाना खराब है, और मैं ये नहीं करूँ। वो रोक टोक कौन लोग करेंगे? जो थोड़ा कट्टरता रखेगा, या मौलवी है कोई, पूरे मुसलमान नहीं रखेंगे।
अच्छा।
जैसे मान लो कोई पढ़ा लिखा नहीं है, उर्दू कुरान, तो वो उस पर रोक टोक नहीं करेगा। इस्लाम में गाना मना नहीं है, ये मैं कहता हूँ, क्योंकि अगर इस्लाम में गाना मना होता तो ख्वाजा साहब कव्वाली नहीं सुनते। इस्लाम में गाना मना होता तो बुल्ले शाह चूड़ियाँ पहन के नाचता नहीं। बुल्ले शाह के गुरु ने बोल दिया था कि आपको तो, अरे यार, भगवान तो नाचने से मिल सकता है, खुदा तो नाचने से मिल सकता है। उसने नाचना शुरू कर दिया और उसी में उसने उसको पा लिया। अब बुल्ले शाह का मैं कलाम गाऊंगा ना तो एकदम पूरी बात फिट, मतलब भंगिया कहाँ होगा उसका, मौलवी पे होगा। जो वहाँ मस्जिद में नमाज पढ़ने वाला है उस पे होगा उसकी सीधा चोट। और उन्होंने इस गाने को हराम किया। बाकी अल्लाह के घर से गाना हराम नहीं। अगर अल्लाह के घर से गाना हराम होता तो पैदा ही नहीं करता, पैदा ही नहीं करता।
All right. So here we have a little bit of a taste of what Sufism is from an actual group of Sufis, right? So let's take a minute and maybe just respond, right? So what do you notice from the video? What emotions does it spark? What questions does it raise for you? And you can either raise your hand or you can put something in the chat. We'll go from there.
If you know how to raise your virtual hand on Zoom, that would be.
Yes, your virtual hand. Sorry, thank you for the clarity.
I'll also look for physical hands. Susan, did I see your hand, or were you like more applauding? You might have
I
been
was applauding, yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Wasn't sure if that was Janet's hand.
Janet, was somebody named Janet? Did you want to speak?
Okay, let's see. So in the chat, we see struck by the few lines. I enjoyed the beauty and freedom and joy in it. How does it relate maybe to the traditions that you're familiar with, and what are these? And how might it be different? Right? What's the relationship of this tradition to orthodoxy, for example? Goes to the heart directly. Yes, I think that is sort of the heart of the matter. Others? I see Susan's hand.
I was noticing that it seemed like God was just part of their vocabulary, and connecting with God is just natural. That felt good to me. I liked that.
Yeah, it's a lived part of the Sufi experience, right? And I think that's a critical thing, right? I think in this tradition, the yearning is always to be able to connect directly with God, right? Which is really the divine within ourselves. And the sort of central question of Sufism tends to be, who are we? And not just who are we, in the prosaic sense of who are we, are we lawyers or construction workers or doctors, et cetera, but who are we really, right? And the theology of this tradition suggests, right, that we're actually part of the divine, but we've forgotten, right? We've descended from the divine place to this constructed reality. And so the idea is, right, who am I and you, as Daniel puts it, right? I think that's exactly right. And then, right, once we move on the steps of this path, right, according to the Sufis, that actually then deifies our entire existence, right, here on Earth, and the prosaic things that that we do every day, right? So, as you're saying, Susan, that makes connection with the divine part of almost everything, right? A Sufi might do. Amrita, please.
I'm taking a little bit from my experience actually visiting a Sufi shrine in India some years ago. And I've been to temples and churches, and I think the absence of ritual really appeals to me. There's no prescriptive way of worship, just whatever really calls to you. That part of it appeals to me a great deal. And partly what you already said, the direct connection to God. No, I feel like that plays into like the lack of rituals, the lack of some sort of prescriptive way of connection with the divine or with the universe.
Yeah, exactly right. And you put your finger on something important as well, right? That these traditions of Sufi peers or saints, right, in South Asia in particular, and they have these dargahs, right, these shrines in different parts of South Asia that are actually equally sacred to Hindus and to Muslims and to Sikhs, right? A whole, they're sacred to everyone, and you see that this is a result of the Sufis really pushing away these divisions, right, of caste, of class, of formal religion. And as you saw in the video, right, they're even saying, look, the Maulvi, right, the priest in the mosque, the Maulvi is the one that's stung by our music and our lines, right, because they have a certain kind of orthodoxy, whereas the point of our practice really is to just get rid of intercession between the devotee, right, and what's known in Sufism as the beloved, right, the beloved being a metaphor for connection with the divine. Anyone else? Any other thoughts or comments to raise on that? And then I'll get into talking a little bit more formally about what Sufism is. Going once. Okay, let's get into it. And just to pull out as well, right, a few things from the video that I had noted. This is also something that's a reform movement, right? So Sufism was sort of a reform movement within Islam, right? And while these folks view Sufism, right, the folks in the video view Sufism as something that breaks the hadith or the commandments of the Quran, there are also branches of Sufism that actually see themselves as being the most pure interpreters of the hadiths, right, of the Quran, and the most pure interpretation of the Quran. So this has sort of been actually posited as a antidote to fundamentalism within Islam. Hence, right, this rejection of intercession between the devotee and the divine. Hence, the hotline to the divine, which I really loved. A rejection of the names of God in favor of an actual experience of God, right? So they don't care if the God is called Ram or Allah, et cetera, right? It's about actual experience, not book learning, and not about places of worship necessarily. And it's a long-standing tradition, right? So you heard him say, right, that this is these verses have come down the centuries, right? So this tradition has been in South Asia very close to the time it originated. And so around the 7th century CE is when Sufism started. And it's a long-standing tradition from at least the 1200s in South Asia. And then finally, I want to note, on the video that direct experience of the divine through poetry and performance is a really important part of this tradition, right? Which is exactly why some of the most enduring poetry of all time is part of this tradition. Sufi Qawwali, which is the sung performance of this poetry, which you heard a little bit of, is so popular in South Asia and globally. And also why it's an amazing inspiration, right? And a handy tool for our own writing practices, right? People tend to deprive themselves of a lot of sleep or drink a lot or do a lot of drugs to get into these altered states of mind to unleash their creativity, right? And here's an entire alternate path to be able to get there, right? To shift your consciousness in a way that will allow you to take the brakes off your writing and just let that creativity flow. So just a word on the context, right? So Islam came to India through these deep migration and trading relationships, which have been the case, for literally millennia, right? Some of the earliest civilizations, the Vedic civilization, right, was thought to, or actually the Harappan civilization, even before that, was thought to have partly resulted from in-migration from the Middle East. And Islam came to India through these long-established routes, right? Around the 7th century, when Saudi merchants came to the western coastal regions of South Asia, plus further influxes from the north over a period of centuries, and up to the period of the 10th and 11th centuries, right, when Delhi itself became an Islamic sultanate. And as I noted, right, Sufism came pretty much as Islam came. This is really the most mystical form of Islam, right? It incorporates aspects of Hindu philosophy as well, and these traditions have co-evolved in South Asia over that time. The basic idea, as I've mentioned, right, is seeking union with the divine through this mystical path of love. It's got something in common with the Hindu bhakti traditions in that the Sufi believe that there's only one God, right? There's only one supreme truth, which represents the ideal of perfection. So this world is considered an imperfect creation, right? It's a mere reflection of the perfection of God. And this element of imperfection in our lives, right, ultimately can only be transcended entirely, right, after we die, right, and go back to that state of perfection. Because in this worldview, we've sort of descended, right, from this previous state of perfection, which we have forgotten. And we only get it back after we merge ultimately with the divine. So although we're stuck in this imperfection here on earth, right, we can still have a measure of its ecstasy by following the Sufi path of love, right? So this is how the philosophy goes. That love is seen as the bond between God and the individual soul. Inner purity in this case, right, takes precedence over ritual and rite. And in fact, according to the Sufi, right, this kind of inner purity and simplicity is the only means of attaining, right, this kind of union with the divine. And the Sufis see all that's around us, right, all of this world that we're living in as this constructed reality that's largely a distraction from that ultimate goal of union with the divine. As I noted as well, right, Sufism devotes a lot of space to this idea that, you know, of searching for who we truly are, right? So that's who am I question is kind of the central question, right? Which then involves differentiating between what's really real and what's constructed. And ultimately realizing, right, that there's only one I that can truly call themselves an I, right? That is the supreme truth or divinity. And every other I is thought to be a false identity, right, in this space. So once we start to remember this true identity as part of divine perfection or God, right, we can choose to, we can start to change how we live here on earth. And that creates this divinity within our actions, right? So the Sufis then place emphasis on service to humanity, right? Good actions, including charity, even the body itself. You know, someone mentioned embrace of the body and sensuality, right? So the body itself is seen as a divine emanation, and that really creates a prescription for how we live right here on earth. So how does this relate to literature, right? What does this have to do with poetry? So Sufism has actually given us this vast literary treasure in multiple languages. Sufi literature in South Asia, and again, I'm only handling South Asia here, right? I'm not looking at Sufism in the Arabic tradition, which actually predates what's happening, what's been happening for centuries in South Asia, but all the way back to Amir Khusro of the Delhi Sultanate, who was sort of like almost like a Leonardo da Vinci figure in South Asia, right? He was this polymath, multilingual poet, and noble person, who has, you know, was one of the earliest Sufi poets to give us these enduring classics that we can still look at and read today. But this poetry has been written in multiple languages in South Asia, right? So Arabic, Urdu, Persian, Punjabi, Sindhi, all of these are languages of Sufi poetry. Some of it was passed down via oral tradition for many centuries and only got written down in recent centuries. And then the idea really is, right, both with this poetry and with this music, that it has the ability to introduce a spiritual state in those who listen to it, particularly in the form of Qawwali, which we'll get to in a minute. And from Bashra, your question, I will look at a Khusro poem in a little bit, and you'll see his name spelled out when we look at the poem. So this is explicitly, right, a mechanism. This literature and this music are explicitly mechanisms to be able to bring the seeker, this devotee, closer to the divine, right? Which is why it's really, it tends towards this visceral imagery, right? It's not necessarily logical, it's not necessarily sensical, but it works, right, on some deeper level. And often it works even if you don't understand the language that is being spoken. Finally, before we look at another video and look at some poems, you know, I want to say also that Sufi literature shares these obvious and striking similarities with the Bhakti poetry movement, right? So there are multiple crossover figures between these two movements who inhabit both of these spaces. Some of you may be familiar, right? Bhakti poetry originated in South India, you know, in the languages of Tamil and Kannada in maybe the 500s or the 600s CE. And since that time, that movement has been a reform movement in Hinduism. Sufism has been a reform movement in Islam, and they have heavily influenced each other because each one emphasizes this union with the divine. Each one grounds their entire philosophy, right, in this idea that no one can come between you and the divine, right? That it's the seeker's journey and ultimate truth to be able to achieve union with the divine. each one rejects these rituals and intercession, and some of the poetry from Sufism, for example, has actually served as the model, right? So Persian poetry was the model for Bengali bhakti poetry, right? You can trace that line. And there are crossover figures like Kabir, who are actually claimed by both traditions, right? And some of you may be familiar with Kabir, very, very famous poet, who's both a bhakti and a Sufi saint. And it's, people have been arguing for centuries over whether he was Hindu or Muslim. And of course, we know that's a total oxymoron, right? Because he actually rejected both, right? He rejected the name of religion entirely, right? He rejected naming God in favor of God. So you can say actually that one of Sufism's biggest contributions has actually been just bringing together the Hindu and Muslim communities in South Asia. So with that, let's do a couple things. We'll look at one more very short video of just a couple of minutes, this one. Another explication of what Sufism is from Farid Ayaz, who's another Qawwali singer and a devotee of the Bhakti and Sufi saint Kabir, casually talking in a moving vehicle, right, about this relationship and kind of reeling off these verses from both Kabir and then tracing Kabir's lineage back to Rumi, right? It's probably the most famous Sufi saint, but not a South Asian Sufi saint, right? He's a Middle Eastern Sufi saint. So we'll look at this video for about 2 minutes, and then look at a couple of poems, and then discuss the whole body of work. So once again, Fred, if you wouldn't mind telling me if you can see my screen, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, we can see the YouTube video that you previously played.
Oh, now I gotta actually back out of that video and then reshare the screen. So let's do that. Okay, can you see the different video now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can.
Very good. Here we go.
कबीर साहब की वाणी में अक्सर आता है कि ये जो पिंड है इसमें पूरी कायनात समाई हुई, बूंद पड़ी समुद्र में जाने है सब कोई, समुद्र समाना बूंद में जाने बिरला कोई,
जाने
बिरला कोई कोई
कोई
जानता।
अल्लाह कबीर साहब से पहले इस मजमून को इसी मजमून को किसी और ने बांधा है। मैंने आपसे बताया था ना कि ये एक फैमिली है, मैंने आपसे पहले कह चुका हूँ। इस मजमून को बांधा है मौलाना रूम ने। वो फरमाते हैं, गर्चे आदम अंदरूने आलमस्त। मैं तर्जुमा करूंगा अभी इसका। गर्चे आदम अंदरूने आलमस्त, दर हकीकत आलम अंदर आदम। उसका तर्जुमा यह है कि बज़ाहिर तौर पर ये आदमी दुनिया में नजर आता है, बज़ाहिर तौर पर ये इंसान दुनिया में नजर आता है, और अगर हकीकत में देखो तो ये दुनिया इंसान में है।
नजर आनी चाहिए।
ये दुनिया जो है सब कुछ इंसान के अंदर है। सारी बात होती है अपने आप को समझने की। आदमी जितना अपने आप को समझता जाता है तो पाता जाता है अपने आप को।
All right, that exact same idea, right?
There's one simple hearing hack anyone can use to improve their hearing.
We don't need one simple hearing hack to improve our hearing, because hopefully we can we can hear without this ad. Okay, so that same idea, right? That the universe is within the human right? And the journey is inward with the Sufis. Let's also take a look at a couple of poems in this tradition, and then we'll discuss. So I'm going to again share my screen, but this time I'm going to share these poems. So let's see. Can you all see this poem on my screen, Fred?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is a poem by the Kashmiri Sufi Bhakti saint Lal Ded. It was written in Kashmiri. So she was a woman who chose to sort of wander the world, and she actually wandered without clothes, right? She eschewed all trappings of sort of civilization and spent her life trying to find this direct connection. So I'll read this poem and one more from Amir Khusro, and then we'll go from there. So, this world compared to you, a lake so tiny, even a mustard seed is too large for it to hold. Yet from that lake, all beings drink. And into it, deer, jackals, rhinoceri, see elephants falling. From the earliest moment of birth, falling and falling into you. All right, so that is Lal Ded, right? And this again, this very same idea, right? What is the world? What are you? And what is the only I, right? That is possible. So this is from Amir Khusro, right? You stamped yourself, or otherwise known as Chap Tilak in South Asia. This is extremely popular. There are about 1 million sung versions of this poem that was written, 800 odd years ago. So I'll read this one as well. You stamped yourself onto me, took my everything with just a glance. You said the unsayable with just a glance. Making me drink your devotion, you intoxicated me with just a glance. These fair wrists, these green bangles, you took them off with just a glance. I gave my life to you, my cloth dyer. You dyed me in your own colors with just a glance. I gave my whole self to you, Nizam. You made me your bride with just a glance. You stamped yourself onto me, took my everything with just a glance. You said the unsayable with just a glance. And you all will also recognize that this is in fact a ghazal. Some of you who are familiar with that form, all right? You have the refrain on the end of every line. So I'll stop sharing there and just ask for comments and thoughts. What strikes you about these poems, and where is the energy in these poems for you? And also, if you have anything to react to about Faridaya's as well, the video earlier, feel free to. And yes, Amrita, feel free to bring that up. But yeah, what strikes you here? The focus is inward. Can you say more about that, Brooks? If we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Hello. Yes, thank you. That I don't want to say like salvation is within, but the way to know yourself is that the world is within you, that same theme, like just at a glance, the world is smaller than a mustard seed. The scale is, what you're seeking is not in the outside world, but it is smaller than a mustard seed, and it is just inward. And maybe the seeking needs to start by turning inward into your own self rather than an outward view.
Yeah, that poem makes an amazing move, right? I mean, I wish there was a good way to actually share it while I could actually see you all as well. But the poem sort of makes this amazing move, right? So it takes a cosmic scale, right, and turns it into something microscopic, right? So we're actually led to see worlds within worlds, where it's a lake so tiny even a mustard seed is too large for it to hold, and yet, right, at the same time, all beings are falling into that space, right? And then we get this incredible list, right? We get rhinoceri, sea elephants, deer, jackals, right? Like, I mean, just from that moment of imagery, right, you just get this fantastical sense, right, of what it's almost like this black hole where everything is kind of getting sucked in. And that itself, right, acts as a metaphor. It acts viscerally to kind of help us feel, right, this sense of being turned inside out, right, and this philosophy's inner journey without necessarily saying it, which is something I appreciate very much about about this poetry. Daniel, you want to elaborate on the effortlessness piece? So I take it this is about the Khusro piece, right?
Daniel, would you like to unmute?
I was just noticing the way it kept repeating with just a glance. And I don't know, that was just kind of powerful to me, and made me really think a lot about that. A glance from the universe, a glance from like the beloved God. I don't know what that was referring to.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is. And in fact, it's actually an artifact of the Urdu language, which is a really layered space. It's extremely difficult in some ways to translate, some of these poems, right? You can triangulate by getting different translations. And, that was not my translation, but the original poem from Khusro uses the phrase, by meeting my eyes, right? So it's not just a glance, but it's actually, that implies a mutuality of gaze between the devotee and the beloved. And in fact, right, the ultimate truth that's hidden in there is that the devotee is the beloved, right? The divinity is you, and you're actually looking in the mirror. So that glance, obviously, given this is a ghazal and the poet chose that as the refrain, right, to come back to again and again, that's a very significant moment because it symbolizes, right, the meeting of the beloved with the seeker. Let's see, Lynn, I see poems, union, surrender, initiation to another place, like falling in love. The experience doesn't need to make logical sense. Exactly right. It's beyond logic, and these poems work on another level. And it's kind of worth noting, right, on that note, right, that as writers, for our inspiration, these poems work on multiple levels, right? They work because we read and react to the poetry itself, which stands on its own, right? Just as really good poetry. We get inspiration because we react to the existential ideas, right? Because we all want to know who we really are, right? And these poems are different ways to engage with that question. And we can extend them, right? We can intertwine them with ideas from our own traditions to create writing that's both in the Sufi tradition and whatever tradition we're coming from as well. And then, as I mentioned, these poems, and particularly the experience of them as sung or performed, Qawwali, can allow us to move into spaces of ecstasy, right? Divine ecstasy, which can really help us take the brakes off as writers. Any further thoughts or comments? I see, Fred, you have a hand. Go for it.
Yeah. Lynn, did you want to say or ask more about that? I saw that you unmuted for a bit. And then, yeah, I do have a question.
Yeah, Lynn, please.
No, not really. I think I said it all in the chat box.
Very good.
That's good. I was going to ask, the speaker in the Khusro poem is female and references like wearing like delicate bracelets and becoming the bride of the, I guess, of the divine. And I'm curious, first of all, is that common in Sufi poetry? And what was that in any way kind of a risk or transgressive at the time that poem was written? It just surprises me a little bit, and I think it's like I read a couple of translations of it to make sure I was reading it right, and indeed, yeah. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, no, that's actually a question with a layered answer, a multi-layered answer. I mean, one, sort of the surface layer answer of that is yes, it does happen commonly in Sufi poetry and also in Bhakti poetry. It's a common move for the relationship between the divine and the devotee to be envisioned as a relationship between lovers, and the divine usually is the male partner in that, right? So that happens in Bhakti, that happens in Sufi as well. But I think the deeper, there's a deeper interpretation, which is that, which again goes back to this question of who are we really, right? And a rejection of these earthly identities. And one thing that Sufis and Bhakti poets do is actually reject the very concept of gender, right? And understand that, right, we have these identities, whatever gender identities may be in this place, and they're not really who we are. And that's made explicit actually by some of the Sufi saints in different poems that they write, and also in some of the sort of treatises on Sufism I've read, right? That is made explicit that actually gender isn't real, right? Because it's not really defining our deepest identity. And you can actually see this operating very dramatically, particularly in the poems of female Bhakti/Sufi poets. Like Lal Ded is a great example, right? Where they just challenge the entire concept of gender. And in fact, they challenge the entire concept of the body, right? And say, look, the body isn't real, right? So why are you obsessed, right, with the form of my body when I'm so much more than this? So, I think it's actually a very compelling thread, because some of these poets, right, were taking risks in making those suggestions, right? I mean, some of these ideas of gender were, I think, centuries, and even the body were centuries ahead of their time. And some of them, right, got themselves into hot water with the authorities. But then again, right, I think that has been the case for Sufis, for many Sufis, right, just because of the very iconoclasm of what they were suggesting, which was actually quite threatening to the authorities in Islam.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And there's a couple of good questions in the chat, but just as a follow-on to that, I'm curious, I think the aspects of God or the divine, different traditions often emphasize different aspects, like creator or merciful. I mean, there's many, many, many. And I'm curious if this is probably a pretty big question, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about why that quality of sort of beloved is the kind of sort of chief or principal way of talking about divinity in this tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it is a complicated answer. I think the short answer is that love is really is the central theme, and it connects in sort of ways that I haven't fully thought through to this idea of self-love, right? That ultimately what we're doing is looking in the mirror through this tradition, right? And looking at our deepest, our very deepest selves, and kind of realizing, right, that after, in this theology anyway, right, we're descended for perfection. We descend onto the earth, and then we ascend, right, after death back into perfection. But to understand that we are perfect here and now, right, is kind of a radical thing, right? I mean, it's something that you're seeing in a lot of self-help books now, but actually the Sufis came up with this idea many, many centuries ago and have emphasized it. And a big part of that, right, is this idea of love of the self, right? But the deepest truth of what the self is, right? Not just some superficial identity that we've sort of fallen in love with here. And then that extends outward, right? It extends towards our body. It extends towards the body of our lover. It extends towards other human beings through this path of service to others, right? And Celine, thank you for bringing that in. I appreciate also and encourage people to bring in, right, as they have knowledge of these traditions, to bring that in. Yes, I think that's spot on and a very good explanation. And I also want to say that Sufism is not a monolith, right? There are, I mean, even just in South Asia, there are at least 5, maybe 6 major Sufi traditions. And as you saw, right, we even saw a disagreement earlier of whether Sufism follows the Quran or whether it doesn't follow the Quran but throws it away. I mean, that's even a debate. There are a couple, I mean, there are a number of books that are sort of accessible to Western writers that you can use for an introduction. The one that I like is called, it's called The Garden of Truth, The Vision and Promise of Sufism, and it's by Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Some of you may be familiar with this book. But he has his own sort of flavor of Sufism, right? That has a particular emphasis. It's not necessarily going to be the emphasis of every thread of Sufism.
So just to quickly read what Celine said, Sufism is called a path of the heart with the heart as representative, and in reality, the instrument for intuition and the felt sense of God or goddess. So the beloved becomes a term to use.
And then the earlier question from Kimberly, does this poetry move away from personal identity or towards a larger identity? Kimberly, do you want to say any more about what's sparking that question, or what you mean? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the Sufi path, but in some paths, the personal identity is dissolved. And once I guess the mental mechanism, you've called it something else, that perpetuates the personal identity is dissolved, then there can be eventually, I mean, emptiness is one word, but then you come into this heart as the central communication hub between the divine and the between of the divine. I'm not going to say between at that point.
I mean, in my experience, the way that has worked is sort of casting away the things about our personal identity here and now that aren't, part of this reality, right? The ultimate reality. And understanding, right? Like, I think when Nasser talks about this, he talks about how so much of our identity in this world is actually, about false or unimportant things, right? And casting away the sort of false I to get to the true I, right? Which is a divine I, is part of how this tradition works. And ultimately, in terms of the end goal, I think the Bhakti saints and the Sufis both had some degree of debate about this, right? So in the bhaktis had different endpoints to where they thought the devotee was supposed to go. Some of them actually emphasized merging into the divine, and some of them said, well, I want to spend eternity at the feet of my God, right? If my God is Krishna, right, I want to be in Krishna's highest heaven with Krishna, but I don't become Krishna. And my sense is that the Sufis have a similar kind of debate in that, it's ascension to a state of perfection where we realize that we remember our own perfection, right, and we become divine ourselves. Whether you call that merging with God or remaining a perfect entity that remembers its divinity, I'm not sure is all that material. Although, the debates can go on.
And there's only so far. Well, at some point the mind has to drop because it can't conceptual can't, which is nice why the singing is so great, because then the concept, because concepts can't really.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I see we're coming to the end of our time as well, Fred. I know that you had wanted to say a word or two, so why don't you?
Before we close, you touched on this a little bit, Shankar, but Bernadette asks, sort of wondering how and if the poems lose meaning in translation. So if you want to say any more about that, I think it's a good question.
Well, I'm always you can count me among the translation frustrated, which often leads me to retranslate poems myself. If I happen to know the language. Yes, you can lose meaning. Translation is both a philosophical and a political exercise, right? I mean, there are a lot of different nuances. There are translators whose translation philosophies match mine, which, to try to make it spare and make it as sort of faithful to the original context as you possibly can, right? I'm not necessarily a florid sort of embellisher in translation, but then again, it also depends on the piece, right? So I think where you have translation difficulties, it's also helpful to see more than one translation so you can kind of get a flavor, right, through triangulation of what that original was like. It's not an impossible exercise. It's not going to be the exact same, but I do think you can recreate the experience of a Sufi poem in English effectively with careful attention to the way things are translated.
Thank you very much. We are at time, so is there anything else burning before I just say a few words on the close? Okay, Shankar, please.
I assume you were going to mention the upcoming class, Fred.
Indeed, yes. Don't worry, I won't forget.
My mind.
Yeah. So Shankar, thank you. Here, I'll pin myself. Shankar, first of all, thank you so much. This was really, I think, illuminating is a nice word, and just a wonderful use of an hour. So thank you really so much for your generosity in sharing this with us. And for everybody here, I want to mention that Shankar has a 4-week course coming up with writers.com. It begins on July 25th. It's called You Are Drinker and You Are Wine, Writing with the South Asian Sufis. So if you've enjoyed this kind of taste this evening, then you can really explore deeply and really merge the sort of sensibility of Sufism into your own poetry writing in that course. And as thanks for joining us in this free workshop, we're going to be sharing with you a discount code for 15% off that course. Look for that in the follow-up email that we'll send out tomorrow or Wednesday at the latest. So thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, please, Shankar, back to you.
And just on the class, folks, I mean, it'll be, I feel bad for talking it to you so long in this workshop. When we do the class, generally we'll do deep reads, and we'll write together as well, right? So we'll actually be able to react to some of this poetry in real time, and of course, you'll have extensive notes as well to follow along when as well as Qawwali performances. That's the other thing that we didn't quite have time to kind of really merge ourselves into a Qawwali performance. But this, you can find a lot on YouTube, and this, there's a channel called Dream Journey, which is a Pakistani outfit that just goes around preserving Qawwali and other classical music performances in Pakistan, small villages in Pakistan. There are deep traditions there. And maybe, Fred, if you're doing a follow-up email with a discount code, we can put a link or two into a couple of Qawwali performances. Dream Journey has translations as well, and some of these are by famous Sufi saints in Punjabi or Urdu. So enjoy those at your leisure, and I hope I'll see some of you for the 4-week class in a few weeks.
Shankar, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for being here. Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Happy writing.